Ever flip over your smoke detector to read that tiny print?
Oh, yeah.
No judgment if you have, I haven't either. But hidden in there, usually a little warning about radioactive material.
Right. You don't think about it too much.
You really don't. And it's a good reminder, though, that even everyday things, right, they've got these components that need to be disposed of properly.
Yeah.
So that got us thinking, what happens to that stuff, especially the bigger stuff, when it needs to be disposed of?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that happens safely, responsibly?
Yeah, where does it go?
Exactly.
Today.
The big question.
So that's our deep dive today into safe and compliant radioactive waste disposal. We got our hands on some materials from GIC Medical Waste Disposal. Think of it like their insider's guide,
Right.
and we're breaking down what's actually a surprisingly complex industry.
Yeah, it's really easy to think this is like a niche thing.
Right. Like, oh, hospitals, labs.
Yeah.
But it brings up bigger questions like public safety, environmental protection, just how we as a society deal with these materials.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And the source material, they emphasize two things, safety and compliance. Why are those things so important when we talk about radioactive waste?
Well, it's more than just trash, right? Radioactive waste, it doesn't break down like your banana peel in a landfill.
Right.
It's dangerous because of the radiation. Exposure can be really bad news health-wise. And it's not just us now. We have to think about future generations, too. We don't want to leave a mess for them to clean up.
Yeah.
That's where all the regulations come in. EPA, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you've got all these agencies. Strict rules about handling, transporting, disposing of this stuff. It's the real deal.
So not as simple as, just tossing it in the bin and hoping for the best.
No, not at all. And that's where a company like GIC steps in. They're like your guide through this maze of regulations, making sure everything is done right so facilities can breathe easy knowing they're covered. They get that peace of mind.
Okay, so they're like the radioactive waste whisperers.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that.
Copyright that.
Okay. All right. But it's interesting. One phrase they use is stress-free service. What kind of real-world anxieties do you think facilities dealing with this kind of waste have?
Think about it. You're dealing with material where even a small mistake can have huge consequences.
Right.
The potential for contamination, accidents, and then there's the whole compliance piece. The regulations are always changing.
Yeah. And let's face it, in this day and age, one wrong move ends up all over the news.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
The reputational damage could be irreversible. So it makes sense that GIC is really honing in on this idea of being a reliable partner, taking on that burden.
Absolutely. Peace of mind is invaluable in this business.
Right, absolutely. But how do they actually do it? They have this process overview in their materials. So walk us through it. What's actually happening behind the scenes?
Well, first things first, assessment. You have to know what you're dealing with, right?
Right, yeah.
Is it from a hospital, research lab, some industrial application? Each one's different, requires a tailored approach. What are the specific radioactive isotopes? How radioactive is it? What's the physical form? Solid, liquid, gas? They look at it all.
Okay, that makes sense. So after they figure out what they're dealing with, then what?
Then comes the collection. They use these specialized containers, to prevent any leaks, minimize exposure during transport. Safety first.
Right, of course. And then, so we've got it all packed up safely. It gets whisked away to some high-tech facility.
Yeah.
Like, are we talking hazmat suits and robotic arms from those sci-fi movies?
Okay, maybe not the hazmat suits, although I'm sure there are some somewhere. But the technology is definitely pretty advanced. Let's call it advanced processing. One example, vitrification. They mix the waste with glass, melt it at these crazy high temperatures,
Wow.
and it forms this solid glass matrix. Basically, it traps the radioactive stuff so it can't escape.
So it's not just about finding a deep enough hole anymore.
Not anymore, no. It's a lot more sophisticated than that these days.
Okay, so then what? What happens to that glass block? Where does it go? So
Yeah.
we've got this super secure glass block ready to go. What happens to it? Where does all this safely contained waste actually end up?
That's what they call responsible disposal, and it's probably the trickiest part,
Right.
They really emphasize doing it right, which means strict guidelines, using the best disposal methods, all that good stuff. These materials don't get into the specifics, but it's gotta be pretty involved.
Yeah, doing it right is kind of vague. Like, what are we actually talking about here?
So some waste, especially after it's been treated, like they reduce the radioactivity, they might actually send it to a landfill.
Landfill, really?
Right, sounds crazy, but these aren't your everyday landfills, of course. We're talking special liners, monitoring systems, the whole 9 yards to make sure nothing leaks out into the environment.
So like a high security, super engineered landfill. just for radioactive stuff.
Exactly. It's serious business. Location, construction, monitoring, it's all held to the highest standards. Got to make sure it's safe in the long run.
Makes sense. Okay, but what about those vitrified blocks, the glass ones? Those seem a little hardcore for even a special landfill.
You're right, those are a different beast. They often go to these long-term storage facilities.
Ah,
Sometimes they're deep underground, geologically stable formations.
like old mines or something?
Yeah, something like that. Or they build special repositories. The idea is to put as many barriers as possible between the waste and the rest of the world. You've got the rock itself, then concrete structures, and of course, the vitrified waste form. It's all about keeping that stuff contained until the radioactivity dies down to a safe level.
Which could be hundreds, thousands of years, right?
Exactly, it's a long game. And that just shows how important responsible disposal is. It's not just our problem now, it's about generations to come. We're talking about protecting the future.
That's pretty intense when you think about it that way.
Hmm.
So you've got these different disposal methods, all about safety and long-term containment. But back to GIC for a sec. They make it sound pretty seamless, but I imagine there's a lot going on in the background. What makes them stand out in this whole waste disposal world?
One thing that really jumps out, they emphasize no contracts,
Really?
which is pretty rare in this business, especially when you're dealing with something as, well, radioactive as this stuff.
Yeah, that is strange. Most companies want you locked in, right? So what's the deal with that?
I think it shows they're confident. They believe in their service. They're not trying to trap anyone into a long-term thing. It's about trust, flexibility, building a relationship.
Interesting. So more about proving themselves every step of the way than just holding on to clients.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about contracts. They really emphasize their compliance expertise, too.
Right, they mentioned that.
They offer consulting, training, all that to help facilities keep up with those ever-changing regulations we talked about.
Yeah, they're really hands-on helping facilities navigate that whole world.
It's like having a radioactive waste whisperer on call
There you go.
to walk you through all the ins and outs, which I imagine would be very reassuring if you're in that position. Oh, absolutely. Takes a lot of the pressure off knowing you've got experts in your corner. And they don't stop there. They also talk about their customizable solutions, especially when it comes to the containers.
Right, they mentioned that they've got options for sharps, biohazards, pharmaceuticals, really tailoring it to the client's needs.
Exactly. One size fits all doesn't cut it in this business. They get that, which is important. You need that flexibility when you're dealing with this kind of stuff.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about GIC, their process, what makes them different. But let's take a step back for a second. We've been talking about radioactive waste, safety, compliance. What does it all actually mean? Why should someone who's never even seen a radioactive material warning sign care about any of this?
It's a good question. I think it boils down to this. How we deal with hazardous waste, especially something like this, it says a lot about us as a society.
Well,
It's about protecting public health, the environment, making sure future generations inherit a planet that's not contaminated. It's bigger than just us.
yeah, it's easy to forget that sometimes, right? We get caught up in the day-to-day. But this stuff has a long-term impact.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is, this whole field, it's not standing still. It's constantly evolving.
Right, you mentioned earlier that there's actually research being done on recycling radioactive materials.
It's pretty wild, right?
Yeah, I always thought, once it's radioactive waste, that's it, game over.
Hmm.
But recycling, that's incredible. What else is out there? What other innovations are on the horizon?
Well, recycling is definitely a game changer if they can figure it out. But even beyond that, the treatment technologies are always improving. They're finding new ways to neutralize or reduce the radioactivity, make it easier to manage in the long run.
So it's not just about containing it forever anymore.
Not necessarily, no. We're getting smarter about how we deal with the waste itself.
That's amazing. And I imagine that leads to even more innovation, right? New containers, safer disposal methods.
Exactly. It's a constant cycle of improvement. And the stakes are high, so we can't afford to get complacent.
Well said. So there you have it, a glimpse into the often unseen world of radioactive waste disposal. It's meticulous, it's high-tech, and it affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
And it's always changing.
Exactly. It's a great reminder that innovation never stops, and that even the most complex challenges can be tackled with ingenuity and a commitment to safety. Until next time, keep exploring.